These are proud people. These are resilient people. They are extremely innovative, entrepreneurial, and very, very strong. They have a very strong constitution. And what I saw there was a deep and abiding faith in their fellow Ukrainians.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. As we record, news has come that a dozen senators have asked for a U.S. investigation of the killing of Palestinian American Shireen Abu Akleh. That's on top of 57 members of the House who are calling for the same thing. No reaction from President Biden. Actually, what we need is not another investigation. There's been probably 5, all with the same conclusion. What we need is for Congress to cut off the billions of taxpayer money that it gives to apartheid Israel. On June 19th, the Palestine Museum US had a ceremony where it unveiled a portrait of Shireen Abu Akleh that it had commissioned from noted Palestinian artist Jacqueline Bajani.
I'd like to welcome you here to the Palestine Museum US, and I was hoping that we would welcome you on a better occasion. However, things are what they are. Today we are getting together to celebrate the life of Shireen Abu Akleh, and also to talk a little bit about the circumstances of her death and to talk a little bit about her. I'm going to start the session with some remarks. Then this will be followed with a more formal statement or eulogy read by a more competent speaker than I am. Certainly the things that are happened and things that Israel has done and has been doing, there are no words for this. There are no words for the acts that they've committed. We could search the English language and we would not find any words that can describe what they did and how they did it. I should point out, and I'd like to thank some of the organizations who supported us here in this event: Palestine Rights, the Tree of Life Educational Fund, Jewish Voice for Peace, American Muslims for Palestine, Mending Minyan, the Peace Council of Greater New Haven, Middle East Crisis Committee, and The Struggle. We're also thankful to the Ben & Jerry Company for providing ice cream for our event here. As you know, Ben & Jerry had closed down their operations in the illegal settlements in Palestine, and we thank them and appreciate that effort and their position on those matters, and we wish other U.S. companies would do the same. This is the scene from Shireen's funeral. As you can see, there are about 15 or 20 people holding the coffin and carrying it, and the Israeli police attacked them because they noticed that they were holding Palestinian flags. And the Palestinian flags are banned in Jerusalem. And as you can see, these policemen, there's a person on the ground here, totally not in a position to confront anybody, and they continue to beat him up with sticks. This person has one arm free and is using it to fend off the beatings by the policemen. And the other people, some of them have fell down. At some point, the people in the front collapsed and the casket almost fell to the ground. And then, until other people jumped underneath it and propped it up. I don't think anybody in the world can explain why any police department or why anybody would want to do anything like this. I mean, it is totally, totally unexplainable, and there aren't any words that can explain how could anybody do this. And we're not just marking the killing of Shireen today. Israel kills Palestinians on a daily basis. You know, there's hardly any day that passes that they don't kill 1, 2, or 3 people, depending on, you know, how convenient that day was for them. About 10 days after Shireen was killed, this journalist also, perhaps she was not as famous, as well known as Shireen was also killed by the Israeli military. She had gotten a new job as a reporter, and this was her 3rd day on the job. And you could see her body on the ground here, and there are 2 soldiers standing, waiting for her to die before they let the ambulance come and pick her up. It is as common for Israelis to kill Palestinians and not allow ambulances to come to provide any first aid to them. So that's another feature of what Israel does, and that's one of those things that words don't exist for describing it. Now, this is the funeral of Ghofran. Her name is Ghofran Warasne. And this is, if you thought Shireen's funeral was chaotic, wait till you see this. At this point, I would like to invite Justine McCabe to come and provide the formal eulogy for Shireen Abu Akleh.
Nice to see you all here on this sad occasion. I'd like to start with some words that may address what Faisal was saying. They're the words of philosopher Judith Butler, her book Frames of War. And she says, one way of posing the question of who we are in these times of war is by asking whose lives are considered valuable, whose lives are mourned, and whose lives are considered ungrievable. We might think of war as dividing populations into those who are grievable and those who are not. An ungrievable life is one that cannot be mourned because it has never lived. That is, it has never counted as a life at all. We can see the division of the globe into grievable and ungrievable lives from the perspective of those who wage war in order to defend the lives of certain communities and to defend them against the lives of others, even if it means taking those latter lives, unquote. So contrary to how Israel treats Palestinians as non-lives, as ungrievable, we insist today that Palestinians are a grievable people and that the loss of Shireen Abu Akleh is clearly grievable. We gather to remember Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, as she was wearing a prominently marked press jacket and helmet when she was shot dead by an Israeli sniper on May 11th in Jenin in occupied Palestine. She was 51 years old. We're here to grieve her death, but also celebrate her life. Shireen reported for Al Jazeera for 25 years. She was widely respected internationally and beloved across the Arab world, especially. In Arabic, Shireen means sweet, gentle. From all we know, she was sweet, kind, and funny. She was also a great role model for other women, especially Arab women. Shireen was both Palestinian and American. She was a Christian among her largely Muslim fellow Palestinians. With this heritage, she embodied the multiculturalism that has always characterized Palestine, despite Israeli attempts to make something Palestine is not and has never been exclusively Jewish. Above all, Shireen was dedicated to reporting these truths: the truth of the brutality of Israel's illegal military occupation of 55 years, the truth of the Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe, when the majority native Christian and Muslim Palestinians were ethnically cleansed by the first Israelis from 1947 to 49. The truth that in defiance of international law and a condition for Israel's admission to the United Nations, Israel refuses to allow millions of Palestinian refugees to return to their home and land in Palestine. And finally, the truth of Israeli apartheid over all historic Palestine, as documented by several human rights bodies, including Israel's Beit Tselem, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International. Shireen's witness challenges us, her fellow Americans, to also speak the truth about our government's complicity in the terrorism and injustice of Israeli occupation and apartheid. We give Israel more than $3.8 billion of our hard-earned tax dollars annually. We protect Israel from any condemnation at the UN Security Council for its human rights violations. Israel buys our weapons, including sniper rifles, with much of that aid, and then tests them out, as in this case. As I think about Shireen's murder, it's hard not to think about the enormous support we're giving to Ukrainians for resisting Russian aggression. Why not the same for Palestinians who are resisting dispossession, mostly peacefully and mostly by just staying on their land? Shireen constantly shone a light on the reality of the U.S.-Israeli special relationship, that we share the same national formative acts of ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism. And significantly, Israel and the United States share a denial of these histories. Thus, like Palestine itself, Shireen was a casualty of settler colonialism. To bring this issue even closer to home today, as we also celebrate Juneteenth, when chattel slavery was ended in America, consider how Israeli soldiers killing unarmed Palestinians is no different from American policemen killing unarmed African Americans, Palestinians because they're not Jews, and blacks because they're not white. Ultimately, Shireen's murder as a journalist challenges us to stand up for freedom of the press everywhere. Her life challenges me not to look the other way. May Shireen Abu Akleh rest in peace. Thank you.
This is Ali Hassan Harb, stabbed to death by an Israeli settler on June 21st. Harb and relatives had been standing on their land on which a settler had built a tin shack. settlers do this illegal building and then claim the land for themselves. Harb had literally been standing and doing nothing more when he was stabbed in the heart. According to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, the stabbing happened in the presence and the protection of the IOF, which prevented medical aid to Harb and left him to bleed to death. We heard about this killing from the blog of Richard Silverstein, that's called Tikkun Olam. In commenting on an Israeli police report on this case that claimed it was not known who killed Harb, Silverstein charged that the Israeli police were, quote, accessories to terrorism. Now more of my interview with Barbara Wein, who is a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., and who returned a few weeks ago from a trip of religious figures to Ukraine. Now let's get into the politics. A big charge of what is a large section of the U.S. and international left is that what's going on in Ukraine is a proxy war, and that Ukrainians are only fighting because the U.S. and its allies are manipulating them. What do you think of that description?
I think it's an insult to the Ukrainian people. I think it's an insult to the two nonviolent revolutions that they themselves has instituted. I think it's an insult to the 30 years of independence that they've been forging, independent of anything we did. These are proud people. These are resilient people. They are extremely innovative, entrepreneurial, and very, very strong. They have a very strong constitution. And what I saw there was a deep and abiding faith in their fellow Ukrainians. They were not looking to be rescued by the West, as Zelensky himself said. I don't need a ride out of my country. I need to be able to defend myself. I don't want a ride. I want weapons. So they are in the driver's seat on this. And the important thing to remember is that they are really trying to forge their own future and not take marching orders from anybody. And they've been doing this for a long time. And if you read the history of Ukraine, they know you can see they've been battered by many superpowers, but they've tried to maintain the course, that they can shape the course of human events themselves. And I feel that the parliaments, the minister of culture we met with, the ministers of education we met with, they're deeply appreciative of our solidarity, but they're not waiting for the script from us. They are in charge of their own destiny. And what I saw was a deep and abiding patriotism, which is very different from nationalism. Patriotism is the belief in values and principles and universal standards of rights. Nationalism requires you to have enemies, and we've seen the ugly face of nationalism, both in the United States and around the world with the rise of authoritarian dictatorships. This is not what I witnessed in Ukraine. What I witnessed in Ukraine was patriotism. The belief in their country, the belief in their people, the belief in a multi-faith, pluralistic democracy. That's what they're pursuing.
Again, this question of manipulation, I have to bring it up because so much of the U.S. left believes it. Are these people saying, well, we won't kill, that's our principle? Or are they saying what we said during Vietnam, that the whole cause is nonsense and we shouldn't be fighting, we shouldn't be resisting?
No, they're coming from a deep and abiding belief in the sanctity of all life. And they were conscientious objectors way before Russia invaded. No, they're not critiquing the war per se, but they're saying other means have to be pursued as well. And some of them believe in the sanctions. Some of them believe that negotiations have to be pursued. Some of them believe that pouring weapons into Ukraine is actually going to escalate and cause a much greater conflagration. So they're not monolithic in their views. And can I just step back and say, for the viewing audience who don't know, 500,000 young men refused to fight in Vietnam. 500,000 young men refused to fight in Vietnam, 4,000 of whom were imprisoned, many of whom went underground or assumed different identities, many of whom fled to Canada, but the rest of them came out fully and burned their draft cards because they believed we were not on the wrong side in Vietnam, we were the wrong side. And we were fighting, a national liberation movement. So we had a very robust anti-war movement. It took about 6 years to scale up, but that is very different from an invasion of your own country. So I think we need to distinguish the anti-war movement here during Vietnam and those that are under siege from Russian bombardment right now. Very different circumstances, but I'm very proud of the history of conscientious objection in the United States. And by the way, during World War I, we imprisoned conscientious objectors at Leavenworth. We stripped them naked and we hosed them down with freezing cold water in the hopes that they would die of pneumonia, and many of them did. And I highly recommend Steve Cohen's book called Jailed for Peace, which is the history of draft resistance from colonial times up until World War II.
Now, speaking of resistance, let's talk about Russia. Though you didn't travel to Russia, I understand you know a lot about the Russian anti-war movement. Could you inform us on that?
Well, the war is not popular in Russia. The unpopularity of this war is spreading. Russia has committed 138,000 troops into Ukraine, a third of which have died. So help me with my math. Is that about 45,000 Russian young, beautiful boys have died? Young men, some of whom have committed horrendous, unspeakable atrocities. I'm never going to excuse that. But my feeling is that Russian society may turn against this war in the next 6 months. We saw this with the Chechen wars. And on Victory Day, at the Victory Day parade, all the pundits and all the analysts around the world assumed that Putin was going to announce a mass mobilization of Russian society against Ukraine. He did not. He did not, and he has not scaled up a mass mobilization of Russian males in the country, because I think that people would quickly turn against that. Even in this massive disinformation media space in Russia, the word is getting out. And we've been testing anti-war messaging in Russia. And I can't really go into the details and the methodology of how that's being done, because again, it would put people at risk. But we're finding that the most effective anti-war message to break through the Russian propaganda is to say, they're coming for you next. The Russian military will be conscripting your son, husband, and brothers. And that gets people's attention. They seem to be sitting up and noticing that. Some of the other really promising trends and developments we've seen is hashtag Call Russia. So the Russian diaspora around the world that are living outside Russian borders obtained 40 million Russian phone numbers off the internet. And they've been calling them since early March, trying to engage with Russians inside Russia to sow cognitive dissonance about the war and say, you're actually not fighting Nazis in Ukraine. and they are trying to get out the truth about what's happening with Russian atrocities in the Donbass, in Luhansk, in other areas of Ukraine. And about 60% of the people hang up on them, don't want to engage out of fear or because they believe the propaganda. Another 20% begin to argue with the callers. And these are all Russian speakers, of course, native Russians calling Russians. But there's about 20% who have stayed on the line and said, yes, I'm against this war as well. And my son is over there, and can you help me find him? And Ukrainians have set up a hotline where they have identified the remains of Russian soldiers through forensics and DNA, and they've traced them to their social media posts. And the families have been calling the hotline in Ukraine, talking with these forensic scientists and others, and saying, how can you know that it's my son? And they said, well, we found their dog tag, we did facial recognition technology. And so we have bridges from Russian families to Ukrainians trying to help bury their loved ones or send their remains back to Russia, or at least let them know that they received a burial or where their.
A group of organizations held a expo they called Electrify Your Life. It was in Cascade, near the border of Connecticut with New York State. I got a chance to ride on this electric power bike. It was fun. You pedal for a while and then the bike speeds you up a bit. If you want to go faster, there's a lever to push for extra power. What I was really interested in was lawn care equipment. Besides electric lawnmowers, there was one that worked like a Roomba, all by itself, and it bills itself that it works day and night, even in the rain. We absolutely have to go electric for lawn care. Even little Connecticut puts out or burns up 40 million gallons of gasoline each year just for lawn care. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.